April 12, 1945. The small coastal village of Matsushima, Japan, lay under a blanket of early morning fog as the distant drone of aircraft engines broke the silence. Sachiko Tanaka, 34 years old and painfully thin, clutched her empty rice bowl as she gazed toward the sky with a mixture of fear and resignation. Like many in her village, she believed the American airmen to be monsters who would shoot civilians for sport, a belief that would be challenged in ways she could never have imagined. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a chance encounter between desperate civilians and American airmen during the final months of the Pacific War would not only save lives, but fundamentally transform understanding between supposed enemies, revealing how compassion could emerge in the most unexpected circumstances of a brutal conflict. Lieutenant Commander James Willard shifted uncomfortably in the cockpit of his Grumman TBM Avenger. The aircraft, part of Torpedo Squadron 87 from the USS Ticonderoga, was on its 8th consecutive day of operations over the Japanese home islands. The campaign of strategic bombing and naval blockade had effectively cut off food supplies to much of Japan's civilian population, creating widespread famine conditions that would claim over 100,000 lives before the war's end. Weathers clearing over the target area, reported Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Denton, the bombardier navigator seated behind Willard. Visual conditions expected in approximately 15 minutes. Willard acknowledged with a nod, though his thoughts were elsewhere. That morning's briefing had included intelligence reports of critical food shortages affecting Japanese civilians. The naval blockade had been brutally effective, too effective, perhaps. The squadron's commanding officer had remarked offhandedly that they were starving the enemy into submission, but something about the clinical detachment of that phrase had settled uneasily in Willard's mind. Command confirms primary target is still the railway junction at Sendai, called Radioman First Class Thomas Henley from the rear compartment. Secondary targets remain coastal shipping. The squadron of 12 Avengers continued their flight northward, passing over scattered clouds that revealed glimpses of the Japanese countryside below. 6 Volt F-4U Corsairs flew protective cover above them, scanning for enemy fighters that rarely appeared this late in the war. Japan's air forces had been decimated, with production falling from 2,400 aircraft per month in 1944 to fewer than 500 by April 1945. The once formidable Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a handful of operational vessels hiding in various harbors. Willard's aircraft, nicknamed Katie's Revenge after his daughter Catherine, had flown 37 combat missions. The aluminum skin bore the patina of salt air corrosion, oil stains, and hastily applied maintenance patches, a veteran aircraft for a veteran crew who had survived when many others had not. 6 minutes to target, announced Denton, methodically preparing the bombardier's station. The mission was straightforward: disrupt railway traffic bringing supplies to the few remaining Japanese military installations. But as they approached the coastline, Willard noticed something unusual through a break in the clouds, a gathering of people on a beach several miles east of their primary target. Possible civilian concentration at Vector 270, he reported to the squadron leader through the radio. Request permission to investigate before proceeding to primary? Negative. Katie's Revenge, came the immediate response from Lieutenant Commander Wilson Phillips in the lead aircraft. Maintain course and formation. Primary target is priority. Willard acknowledged the order, but something about the gathering troubled him. It didn't match the pattern of military assembly points they'd been briefed to watch for. Through his canopy, he could see perhaps 50 or 60 people gathered on the beach below. The squadron continued toward Sendai, where they successfully delivered their payloads on the railway junction. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and inaccurate, another sign of Japan's diminishing capacity to defend itself. As they completed their bombing run and turned back toward the carrier, Willard made a split-second decision. "I'm going to take us down for a closer look at that beach gathering," he informed his crew. "Something doesn't feel right." "Sir, Commander Phillips was pretty clear about maintaining formation," Henley reminded him. "Noted, Henley. I'll take full responsibility," Willard replied, already banking the aircraft slightly away from the squadron's return heading. "Denton, Keep your eyes sharp. This could be anything. The Avenger descended to 1,000 feet as they approached the coastal village. Through his canopy, Willard could now clearly see the gathering on the beach. What had appeared to be a military assembly from higher altitude now revealed itself as something entirely different. Dozens of civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, standing in organized lines. They appeared to be gathering something from the shoreline. "They're harvesting seaweed," Denton observed through his binoculars. "Look at the baskets. They're collecting anything edible from the beach." Willard felt his throat tighten. The intelligence reports about food shortages hadn't exaggerated. These people were literally scraping sustenance from the rocks and sand. As his aircraft approached, he could see the civilians looking up in terror. Some running for shelter, others too weak or resigned to move. "Take us lower," Willard ordered, descending to 500 feet. "Slow as we can without stalling." The Avenger's powerful Wright R2600 engine throttled back, allowing the aircraft to practically crawl through the air above the beach. Now Willard could see individual faces looking up at him, gaunt, hollow-eyed expressions of fear and exhaustion. Then something unexpected happened. Rather than continuing to flee, one woman stepped forward, waving her arms frantically. She pointed repeatedly to her mouth and then to the children behind her. "She's trying to communicate something," Henley observed from his position. "I think she's telling us they're hungry," Denton said quietly. Willard circled the aircraft once more, flying even lower. The woman continued her gestures, now joined by others who seemed to overcome their fear in the face of desperate need. One elderly man prostrated himself on the sand in what appeared to be a begging posture. "We need to report this," Willard said finally, pulling the aircraft up and turning toward the open ocean. "This isn't a military target. These are starving civilians." Back aboard the USS Ticonderoga, Willard's unauthorized detour earned him a stern reprimand from Commander Phillips. However, when he described what he had witnessed, the intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Reeves, became interested. "You're certain they were civilians, not disguised military personnel?" Reeves questioned, his pen poised over his notepad. "Absolutely certain, sir," Willard replied. "Elderly, women, children. They were harvesting seaweed for food. I saw baskets, primitive tools. These people are starving." Reeves made several notes before responding. "Our blockade is working as intended, Lieutenant Commander. The civilian population's suffering may accelerate the Japanese government's decision to surrender. With respect, sir, these weren't military targets. They were just people, hungry people." Reeves studied Willard for a moment. "Your concerns are noted, Lieutenant Commander. You're dismissed." That evening, in the officers' mess, Willard found himself unable to eat. The images of the starving civilians haunted him, particularly the woman who had stepped forward despite her fear, desperately trying to communicate her people's plight to an enemy aircraft. "Are you thinking about those civilians?" observed Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Harrison, a pilot from another squadron who had heard about Willard's discovery. Willard nodded. "Intelligence says the blockade is working as intended, as if starvation is just another weapon." Harrison leaned forward. "My father was a Quaker missionary in Japan before the war, spent 10 years there. Always said the Japanese people were some of the most generous and community-minded he'd ever met. Said they would share their last grain of rice with a stranger." He paused, pushing his plate away. "Doesn't seem right, does it?" "No, it doesn't," Willard agreed. "So what are you going to do about it?" Harrison asked. Willard looked up, surprised by the direct question. "Do? What can I do?" "I've reported what I saw." Harrison smiled slightly. "You know, our aircraft carry more than just bombs. We've got ration packs, emergency supplies, things that might mean the difference between life and death for those people." "Are you suggesting we drop supplies to enemy civilians?" Willard asked incredulously. "That would be a court-martial offense?" Harrison finished for him. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the decent thing to do, something to think about anyway." With that, he rose and left Willard alone with his thoughts. 3 days later, Willard's squadron was assigned another mission over the Japanese mainland. This time, their target was a coastal defense installation near Sendai. As Willard prepared for the mission, he made a decision that could potentially end his naval career. In the pre-dawn darkness of the carrier's hangar deck, Willard approached Chief Petty Officer Gerald Mackenzie, who supervised the aircraft maintenance crews. "Chief, I need a favor," Willard began, explaining his plan to drop supplies to the civilians he had seen days earlier. The grizzled chief studied him for a long moment. "You know this could land you in serious trouble, sir." "I'm aware, Chief. Then I suppose you'll need these packed securely so they don't shift during flight," Mackenzie replied, gesturing to several K-ration boxes stacked nearby. "I can have them secured in your aircraft storage compartment in 20 minutes, for ballast purposes, of course." "Of course," Willard agreed, relieved. "Thank you, Chief." "Don't thank me, sir. Just come back alive." The mission proceeded as planned, with the squadron successfully striking the coastal defense installation with minimal resistance. As they turned for home, Willard once again broke formation, signaling to his wingman, "Katie's Revenge to Proud Mary, I've got an engine running rough. Going to take an alternate route back to carrier. Don't worry about escort, continue with squadron. Copied Katie's Revenge," came the response from Lieutenant Samuel Winters in the aircraft designated Proud Mary. "You sure you don't want company?" "Negative, Proud Mary, simple precaution. See you back on the boat." Willard turned his aircraft toward the coastal village he had observed days earlier, descending to 2,000 feet as he approached. "Denton, keep watch for any anti-aircraft positions. Henley, prepare those supply packages." The village came into view, and Willard could see people on the beach again engaged in the same desperate harvesting of seaweed and shellfish. As his aircraft approached, the civilians scattered, all except for one figure who stood her ground, looking up at the approaching American plane. "That's her," Willard said, recognizing the woman who had gestured to them before. "Dropping to 800 feet. Henley, stand by with the first package." The Avenger descended in a gentle arc, slowing as much as aerodynamically possible. Henley positioned himself at the aircraft's small side door, ready with the first bundle of K-rations secured in a canvas bag with a makeshift parachute fashioned from torn bed sheets. "Ready, sir," Henley called over the intercom. "Drop on my mark," Willard replied, carefully positioning the aircraft for a pass directly over the beach. 3, 2, 1, mark. Henley pushed the bundle out, and the improvised parachute deployed, carrying the precious supplies gently downward toward the beach. Below, the woman who had remained standing looked up in confusion as the package descended toward her. "Coming around for another pass," Willard announced, banking the aircraft in a wide turn. Henley ready with bundle 2. They completed 3 more passes, dropping a total of 4 bundles of supplies onto the beach. On the final pass, Willard dipped the Avenger's wings in a gesture of goodwill. To his astonishment, the woman on the beach bowed deeply in response. "I think she understands," Denton said quietly. "Let's hope so," Willard replied, turning the aircraft back toward the USS Ticonderoga. "Let's also hope Commander Phillips buys my story about engine trouble." The unauthorized food drop remained a secret among Willard's crew and Chief Mackenzie. 4 days later, when the squadron was assigned another mission over the same region, Willard was surprised to find additional K-rations and medical supplies mysteriously loaded into his aircraft's storage compartment. "Anonymous donation," Chief Mackenzie explained with a wink. "Several officers contributed. No names, no questions." This time, Willard's wingman Lieutenant Winters was in on the plan. "Engine trouble again? Katie's Revenge?" he asked over the radio as they completed their primary mission. "Afraid so, Proud Mary," Willard replied. "Might need some company this time, though, just to be safe." "Copy that. I'll escort you on your alternate route." The 2 aircraft approached the coastal village together, descending to drop altitude. As they came into view of the beach, Willard was startled to see something new. A large character had been drawn in the sand, visible from the air. "Is that Japanese writing?" Winters radioed. "Affirmative," Denton replied, having studied basic Japanese characters during intelligence training. "It's the character for thank you." Below, a larger group of villagers had gathered, no longer fleeing at the sight of American aircraft. The woman who had first gestured to them stood at the front of the group, waving both arms above her head. As they made their drops, Willard noticed something else. The villagers had arranged small offerings on the beach, carefully arranged seashells, wildflowers, and what appeared to be handmade dolls, visible only from the air. "They're giving us gifts in return," Denton observed, his voice thick with emotion. They've got nothing, and they're still trying to give something back. Over the next 2 weeks, what had begun as one pilot's impulsive act of compassion evolved into an unofficial humanitarian operation involving multiple crews from Torpedo Squadron 87. Commander Phillips, while never explicitly acknowledging what was happening, turned a blind eye to the occasional navigational detours and unexplained consumption of ration supplies. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Reeves, eventually confronted Willard in the officers' mess. "I know what you've been doing, Willard," he said without preamble, sliding into the seat across from him. "You and half the squadron." Willard met his gaze steadily. "Are you here to arrest me, sir?" Reeves studied him for a long moment before responding. "You know, before the war, I was a history professor at Columbia, specialized in East Asian civilizations." He paused, stirring his coffee. "The Japanese have a concept called on, a profound sense of indebtedness and gratitude. When you receive kindness, you're obligated to return it, often multiplied." "I'm aware of the concept, sir," Willard replied cautiously. "Then you should also know that by showing compassion to those villagers, you may have done more to advance American interests than a dozen bombing raids." Reeves slid a folder across the table. "These are reconnaissance photographs taken 3 days ago. Notice anything interesting?" Willard examined the aerial photographs of the coastal village. In one clearing, he could see what appeared to be a message spelled out with white stones. "Arigato." Thank you in Japanese, but spelled in Roman letters for the Americans to understand. The local Japanese military commander demanded that the village turn over any supplies received from American aircraft, Reeves continued. The villagers refused. When soldiers were sent to confiscate the supplies by force, they were met by the entire village, led by a woman named Sachiko Tanaka. Willard looked up sharply. "How do we know her name?" "Because she was arrested and interrogated," Reeves replied grimly, "and because she told her interrogators that Americans were human beings with compassion, not devils as the military government claimed. She was released after 3 days when the local commander decided her insanity posed no real threat." Willard felt his throat constrict. "Is she?" "She's alive, and she's become something of a problem for the local military authorities." Reeves reclaimed the folder. "The official policy remains unchanged, Lieutenant Commander. The blockade continues, but off the record. Your navigation exercises over that particular village are proving to be an interesting case study in psychological warfare, perhaps even shortening the war in ways bombs cannot." As Reeves stood to leave, he added, "Sometimes compassion is the most subversive weapon of all." On May 10, 1945, Willard's squadron was scheduled for what might be their final mission over Japan before the carrier rotated back to Pearl Harbor for refit. As they prepared their aircraft, Chief Mackenzie approached with an unusual item. "Lieutenant Harrison asked me to give you this, sir," he said, handing Willard a small package wrapped in oilskin. "Said his father left it with him before the war." Inside, Willard found a small book, a Japanese-English dictionary, well worn and annotated. A note from Harrison explained, "My father used this during his time in Japan. Thought you might want to leave a more personal message for your friends on the beach. Pages 64 and 137 might be helpful." Willard turned to the indicated pages, finding entries for peace and hope carefully underlined in pencil. With Denton's help, Willard composed a simple message and wrote it on a piece of canvas in both English and crude Japanese characters. They secured it to the largest supply bundle, along with extra rations, medical supplies, and seeds contributed by various crew members. The squadron took off at dawn, completing their assigned bombing mission efficiently despite moderate anti-aircraft fire. When the time came for the now familiar detour to the coastal village, 6 aircraft peeled away from the formation, twice the usual number, including Commander Phillips himself. "Looks like the whole neighborhood showed up to say goodbye," Phillips remarked dryly over the radio as they approached the village. Below, the beach was filled with people, far more than Willard had seen before. They stood in orderly rows, facing the approaching aircraft. As the Avengers descended to dropping altitude, Willard could see that many villagers held small white flags or papers above their heads. "They've prepared a reception committee," Winters observed from his aircraft. The lead aircraft made the first drop, followed by the others in sequence. On the final pass, Willard's aircraft released the special bundle with the message. As it descended by parachute, he dipped his wings one last time to the woman he now knew as Sachiko Tanaka. Through his canopy, Willard watched as the villagers rushed to retrieve the bundle. Sachiko found the message and held it up for others to see. Even from altitude, Willard could see her bow deeply toward his departing aircraft. "What exactly did you write in that message, sir?" Henley asked as they turned back toward the carrier. "Two simple things," Willard replied. "First, that we were leaving, but others would come after us who might continue bringing supplies. And second," Denton prompted when Willard fell silent, "that not all enemies must remain enemies forever, and that one day we might meet in peace." Commander Phillips's voice crackled over the radio. "Katie's Revenge. Form up on my wing. Time to go home." As they flew over the endless expanse of the Pacific, Willard wondered if he would ever learn what became of Sachiko Tanaka and the villagers of Matsushima. Had their small act of compassion made any difference in the larger scheme of the brutal conflict that continued to rage? Or was it merely a momentary connection between individuals caught on opposite sides of forces beyond their control? What none of them could know as they returned to the USS Ticonderoga was that their actions had set in motion events that would ripple outward in ways they could never have anticipated, transforming not just Sachiko's village, but potentially the very nature of how enemies perceived one another in the waning days of the Pacific War. The sun was setting as the squadron approached the carrier, painting the clouds in brilliant hues of orange and red. For Lieutenant Commander James Willard, it was a fitting backdrop to the end of his tour in the Pacific, a tour that had begun with dropping bombs but would end with dropping food to starving civilians. Whether this constituted an act of military disobedience or the highest fulfillment of his duty as a human being remained a question that would follow him long after the engines of Katie's Revenge fell silent. August 3rd, 1945. The coastal village of Matsushima had changed dramatically in the 3 months since Lieutenant Commander James Willard and his squadron had departed the theater of operations. The makeshift food drops had ceased with the rotation of Torpedo Squadron 87 back to Pearl Harbor, but the impact of those brief encounters lingered in ways that transformed the village's relationship with both their own military authorities and their supposed enemies. Sachiko Tanaka now stood as the village's unofficial leader, a position unheard of for a woman in wartime Japan. Her husband had been killed at Guadalcanal 3 years earlier, leaving her to care for her elderly mother and 7-year-old son, Takeshi. The local military commander, Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, had initially tried to suppress what he viewed as treasonous acceptance of enemy aid, but the sheer desperation of the villagers, coupled with the Imperial Army's dwindling control of outlying areas, had forced an uneasy tolerance. "The Americans will return," Sachiko told the gathered villagers as they shared the dwindling supplies from the last airdrop. Their message promised this: we must be patient and maintain our strength. 82-year-old Yoshiro Saito, who had been the village schoolteacher before the war, nodded in agreement. "For 4 years, the government has told us Americans are devils who would take pleasure in our suffering. Yet these devils bring food, while our own soldiers confiscate what little we grow." He gestured to the carefully rationed pile of supplies. "Which shows more humanity?" Captain Nakamura, who had arrived unannounced at the village meeting, stepped forward with 2 soldiers flanking him. The villagers fell silent, tension filling the air. "Teacher Saito speaks treason," Nakamura declared, his gaunt face betraying that he too suffered from the same shortages affecting the civilians. "But I have not come to arrest him today." The captain paused, seeming to struggle with what he needed to say next. "New orders have arrived from prefecture headquarters. All coastal villages are to report any American aircraft immediately. Any civilian found aiding the enemy will face immediate consequences." Sachiko met his gaze steadily. "We are not aiding the enemy, Captain. We are simply trying to survive." "The distinction matters little to Sendai headquarters," Nakamura replied coldly. "I'm also instructed to confiscate any remaining American supplies as evidence of enemy psychological warfare tactics." A murmur of protest rose from the villagers. 7-year-old Takeshi, Sachiko's son, stepped forward suddenly and held out a chocolate bar, the last piece of his treasured ration from the American supplies. "For you, sir," he said, offering it to the surprised captain. "My mother says we must share with those in need." Captain Nakamura stared at the child, then at the chocolate, a luxury none of them had seen in years. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted it. "Your mother teaches dangerous ideas, boy," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Sachiko gently pulled her son back. "Captain, we have hidden nothing. Take what you must for your report, but know that these supplies have kept 23 children alive these past months." The captain looked at the gathered villagers, then back at Sachiko. After a long moment, he turned to his soldiers. "Record that American psychological warfare materials were observed, but had been consumed prior to our arrival." He returned the chocolate bar to Takeshi. "No evidence remains to confiscate." As Nakamura prepared to leave, he paused beside Sachiko. "My brother's family lives near Nagasaki," he said quietly. "They have not had meat or rice in 6 months. Perhaps your American devils will visit them as well." 5,000 miles away at Naval Air Station Alameda in California, Lieutenant Commander James Willard was reviewing transfer orders that would send him to a training command in Florida, far from the Pacific combat he had known for the past 18 months. The war was clearly approaching its endgame, though few predicted how quickly the end would come. "Seems like a waste of a good combat pilot," remarked Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Denton, who had received similar orders. "Teaching cadets how to fly patrol patterns when we could be finishing this thing." Willard smiled slightly. "Maybe the Navy figures we've dropped enough on the Japanese." The reference to their unauthorized humanitarian drops brought a knowing look from Denton. "Ever wonder what happened to them? That village, that woman who kept standing her ground every day," Willard admitted. "Intelligence thought we might be shortening the war in ways bombs couldn't. I keep hoping they were right." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Commander Edwin Reeves, the intelligence officer from their carrier days. Now assigned to Naval Intelligence Headquarters in San Francisco, Reeves looked distinctly out of place among the operational aviators. "Willard, Denton," he greeted them. "Got a minute?" In a quiet corner of the officers' club, Reeves placed a manila folder on the table. "What I'm about to tell you is classified. Officially, this conversation never happened." Willard exchanged glances with Denton. "Understood, sir. Your little humanitarian operation caught the attention of some interesting people," Reeves began. "Office of Strategic Services has been monitoring the results. They've had an agent operating in that region, Japanese-American, deep cover. He's been reporting on how your food drops affected morale and cooperation with Japanese authorities." Reeves opened the folder, revealing aerial reconnaissance photographs of Matsushima. "The village you adopted has become something of a problem for the local military command. Resistance to requisition orders, sheltering deserters, even sending delegations to neighboring villages to spread word that Americans were providing food, while Japanese authorities hoarded supplies." "Are they in danger?" Willard asked, concerned. "Surprisingly, no. The regional commander doesn't have the manpower to crack down on what he considers a minor disciplinary problem. Japan's military is collapsing from within." Reeves pointed to a figure in one photograph. "See this woman? Our agent identified her as Sachiko Tanaka. She's effectively running the village now, using your supplies as a way to unite the community. She's the one who first signaled to us," Willard confirmed. "Stood her ground when everyone else ran. Well, she's standing her ground in more ways now. According to our agent, she's been telling everyone that Americans aren't the demons they've been led to believe, that after the war reconciliation might be possible." Reeves closed the folder. "OSS thinks your food drops did more to undermine Japanese civilian morale than a dozen bombing raids." "So it made a difference," Denton said quietly. "More than you know," Reeves replied, "which brings me to why I'm here." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's a new operation being planned, psychological warfare through humanitarian means. They're calling it Operation Olive Branch. You want us to drop food instead of bombs?" Willard asked incredulously. "On a much larger scale, yes. Selected villages in areas where civilian hardship is highest and military presence is minimal. The thinking is that as Japan faces inevitable defeat, we need to start building bridges to the civilian population who will influence the post-war landscape. Willard considered the proposal. The war's nearly over. Everyone knows it. Why not just wait? Because how we end this conflict will determine how the peace begins, Reeves answered. And because people like Sachiko Tanaka deserve to know that what you started wasn't just a fluke of compassion from a few rogue pilots. Before Willard could respond, the officers' club fell suddenly silent as the radio broadcast was interrupted by a special bulletin. All three men turned to listen as the announcer's voice filled the room. We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The White House has announced that a new type of bomb with unprecedented destructive power was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima this morning. 3 days later, as news of a second atomic bombing at Nagasaki spread through military bases across America, Willard received emergency orders canceling his transfer to Florida. Instead, he and selected crews from his former squadron were being temporarily attached to a classified operation under Joint Army-Navy Command. Operation Olive Branch is being fast-tracked, Reeves explained, as Willard and 14 other pilots gathered in a secure briefing room. The situation has changed dramatically. Japan's surrender may come within days, not months as previously estimated. We need to establish humanitarian contact with civilian populations immediately. Colonel Walter Hayes, the Army Air Forces officer who would command the joint operation, took the podium. Gentlemen, you've been selected because of your experience with Japanese civilian contact, particularly the unofficial operations conducted by Lieutenant Commander Willard's squadron. A map of Japan appeared on the projection screen. Intelligence indicates severe food shortages affecting civilian populations throughout the home islands. Military authorities are confiscating what little remains for last-ditch defense preparations. We believe a humanitarian airdrop campaign could save thousands of lives and establish goodwill that will be crucial during occupation. Willard studied the map, noting that Matsushima had been marked as a primary target. Sir, are we certain the Japanese military won't shoot down aircraft conducting humanitarian drops? They may view this as psychological warfare. A legitimate concern, Hayes acknowledged. That's why each drop will be preceded by leaflet campaigns explaining our intentions. We're also selecting villages with minimal military presence based on intelligence from OSS operatives in the field. The mission briefing continued, outlining the substantial resources being committed to the operation. 24 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers repurposed as cargo aircraft, each carrying several tons of food, medicine, and basic supplies. Fighter escorts would provide protection, and communications specialists would broadcast messages in Japanese, explaining the humanitarian nature of the mission. As the briefing concluded, Colonel Hayes addressed a final point. This operation represents a fundamental shift in strategy. We're no longer simply trying to defeat an enemy. We're beginning to help rebuild a future ally. Your experience with the villagers of Matsushima demonstrated that compassion can sometimes accomplish what force cannot. The following morning, as Willard prepared for the mission, he received a surprising visitor, Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Harrison, whose father had been a missionary in pre-war Japan, had been added to the operation at the last minute. They tell me you dropped supplies on a Japanese village, Harrison said, getting straight to the point, that you communicated with a woman there. Willard nodded cautiously. That's correct. Sachiko Tanaka. Intelligence has been monitoring the situation through an OSS agent. Harrison reached into his pocket and removed a small photograph. This woman. The faded photograph showed a younger Sachiko, perhaps 10 years earlier, standing beside a Western man in missionary attire and a group of Japanese schoolchildren. That's her, Willard confirmed, surprised. How did you... My father took this photograph in 1935, Harrison explained. He established a mission school in Matsushima and several surrounding villages. Sachiko Tanaka was his teaching assistant for 3 years. He reclaimed the photograph. When you mentioned the village name during our conversation months ago, I thought it might be the same place, but I wasn't certain until now. Does she know your father? Knew, Harrison corrected sadly. He died in 1939, before the war. But he spoke very highly of Sachiko in his letters home, said she had exceptional courage and integrity. He smiled slightly. Apparently he was right, if she's the one who stood up to both Japanese authorities and American bombers. This personal connection added unexpected depth to the mission for Willard. The abstract concept of humanitarian aid to faceless enemies had suddenly become intensely personal, a continuation of connections established years before the conflict had turned teacher and student into supposed enemies. On August 11, 1945, Operation Olive Branch commenced with a massive leaflet drop over selected villages in northern Japan. The leaflets, printed in Japanese, explained that American aircraft would be delivering food and medical supplies the following day. They emphasized that this was not a military operation, but a humanitarian mission meant to relieve civilian suffering. The next morning, the first wave of B-17 aircraft, now painted with distinctive red cross markings on their wings and fuselage, departed from Iwo Jima with fighter escorts. Lieutenant Commander Willard, flying a specially modified TBM Avenger, led the section designated for Matsushima. Olive 1 to all aircraft, Colonel Hayes's voice came over the radio from the lead B-17. We are 20 minutes from first drop zone. Maintain radio discipline and follow mission protocols. Any signs of hostile action, divert to secondary targets. As they approached the Japanese coast, Willard felt a familiar tension. Despite the leaflet warnings, there was no guarantee of how Japanese forces might react to American aircraft, even those clearly marked as non-combat. Olive 7 to Olive Lead, Willard radioed, approaching primary target. No sign of air defenses active. Through breaks in the cloud cover, Matsushima came into view. Willard's heart raced as he recognized the beach, where their unauthorized drops had begun months earlier. Now, instead of scattered individuals harvesting seaweed, hundreds of villagers had gathered in the cleared area behind the beach. They had arranged white sheets to form an enormous symbol visible from the air, the universal sign of a red cross. "They're expecting us," Lieutenant Harrison observed from his position as Willard's navigator. They understood the leaflets. The B-17 bomber, following Willard's lead aircraft, began its approach run, precisely calculating the drop zone to place supplies safely away from the gathered villagers. Large parachutes blossomed beneath the aircraft as pallets of food, medicine, and clothing descended toward the village. Willard brought his Avenger lower, circling the drop zone at 1,000 feet. Through his canopy, he could see individual faces looking up, not in fear this time, but in anticipation. At the front of the gathering stood a familiar figure, Sachiko Tanaka, flanked by village elders and a group of children waving white flags. "I'm going to make a low pass," Willard informed his crew and the mission commander. "Visual confirmation of reception." "Approved, Olive 7, came the response from Colonel Hayes. "Keep it brief." The Avenger descended to 500 feet, flying slowly over the gathered villagers. Willard could see Sachiko clearly now, standing tall and dignified as she tracked the aircraft's approach. As they passed overhead, she bowed deeply, then straightened and saluted in a distinctly American style, a gesture she must have learned from their earlier encounters. "She remembers us," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than that," Willard replied. "She was expecting us to keep our promise." The humanitarian drops continued throughout the day, across dozens of villages in northern Japan. Not a single incident of hostile fire was reported, despite the presence of Japanese military installations in the vicinity of several drop zones. Word had spread rapidly through military and civilian channels that these American aircraft were bringing food, not bombs. 2 days later, as Operation Olive Branch prepared for its third and largest mission, world-changing news arrived. Japan had announced its intention to surrender. The war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years was ending. In the chaotic aftermath of the surrender announcement, Operation Olive Branch was temporarily suspended as military leaders assessed the rapidly evolving situation. Willard found himself in limbo, uncertain whether the humanitarian missions would continue now that hostilities had officially ceased. The operations being reconfigured, not cancelled, Reeves informed him during a hurriedly arranged meeting. With surrender, We're shifting from clandestine humanitarian drops to official relief operations. General MacArthur wants to establish immediate goodwill with the Japanese civilian population. What about Matsushima? Willard asked. And the other villages we've been supporting? They're still on the priority list, Reeves assured him. But there's more. OSS wants to make direct contact with Sachiko Tanaka. They believe she could be instrumental in facilitating peaceful relations during the early occupation period. Direct contact? You mean landing? Reeves nodded. A small reconnaissance team, including Japanese-American interpreters. The thinking is that villages like Matsushima, which have already experienced positive American contact, will be valuable bridges between occupation forces and the broader civilian population. 3 days after Japan's formal surrender, Willard found himself approaching Matsushima once again, this time in a transport aircraft, carrying not only supplies, but a small contact team that included Lieutenant Harrison and 2 Japanese-American interpreters. As the aircraft descended toward a small clearing that had been marked as a landing zone by the villagers, Willard felt the weight of historical significance in what they were doing. This may be the first peaceful American landing on Japanese soil, Harrison remarked as they made their final approach. From dropping bombs to delivering hope in a matter of months. The landing was smooth despite the improvised nature of the field. As the aircraft's engines spun down, Willard could see hundreds of villagers gathered at a respectful distance, uncertainty and hope mingling on their faces. At the front stood Sachiko Tanaka, flanked by village elders and, surprisingly, Captain Nakamura, the local military commander. When the aircraft's door opened, Willard was the first to emerge, still wearing his naval aviator's uniform but conspicuously unarmed. He walked slowly toward the assembled villagers, stopping a respectful distance from Sachiko and bowing in Japanese fashion. Sachiko returned the bow, then straightened and addressed him in careful, practiced English. "Lieutenant Commander Willard, Matsushima welcomes you in peace." Willard's surprise must have shown on his face, for Sachiko smiled slightly before continuing. "Your name? On message you sent. I remember from before war. American missionary teach English here." Harrison stepped forward. "My father, Reverend Thomas Harrison. He taught here before the war." Recognition dawned in Sachiko's eyes. "Harrison-san, you are son of Teacher Harrison." When he nodded, tears formed in her eyes. "Your father was honorable man. He taught us English, but also taught understanding between peoples." Captain Nakamura stepped forward, his face a mask of professional composure. "I am Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, Imperial Japanese Army. I am authorized by my superiors to facilitate peaceful transition in this district." He bowed stiffly. "Your humanitarian assistance is acknowledged." The formal greeting broke into more natural interactions as the Japanese-American interpreters began facilitating conversations between villagers and the American team. Children approached cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as Harrison distributed chocolate bars and small toys. Sachiko led Willard to the village center, where a simple memorial had been erected. "For all who suffer in war," she explained through an interpreter. "Japanese and American. We place American food packages here first, to honor those who gave when they could have destroyed." Willard was moved by the gesture. "We dropped bombs on your country for years. Why would you honor us?" Sachiko considered her answer carefully before responding. "When you have nothing, small kindness becomes great light. Your food saved children here, made us question what our leaders said about Americans, made us hope for peace." She gestured toward where her son Takeshi was eagerly showing American chocolate to his friends. "New generation will remember Americans brought food when they were hungry." Over the following days, the contact team worked with Sachiko and even the reluctant Captain Nakamura to establish a model for cooperation that would soon be replicated throughout rural Japan. Medical personnel treated villagers suffering from malnutrition and disease. Agricultural specialists helped restore local food production. Engineers began repairing war-damaged infrastructure. Willard found himself working closely with Sachiko, whose natural leadership and bridge-building abilities proved invaluable. One evening, as they reviewed distribution plans for the next supply delivery, Sachiko shared her perspective on their unusual connection. "When first American plane came, I was afraid but also desperate," she explained through an interpreter. My son had not eaten proper meal in 3 days. I thought if American pilot shoots me, at least my death might save others if he sees we are only hungry civilians. I never would have fired on civilians, Willard assured her. I know this now, Sachiko replied with a slight smile. But then we were taught Americans would kill Japanese without thought. When you dropped food instead of bombs, it destroyed many lives at once. Captain Nakamura, who had been silently observing their conversation, surprisingly added his own perspective. The military told us Americans would slaughter all Japanese if they won the war. That surrender meant death. He looked at the American medical team treating elderly villagers nearby. These actions speak more truth than any words could. As September turned to October, Operation Olive Branch expanded throughout northern Japan, evolving from emergency relief to established humanitarian and reconstruction programs. Willard received orders to return to the United States, his role in the initial contact phase complete. Professional occupation authorities would now take over the longer-term work of rebuilding. On his final day in Matsushima, Willard found Sachiko organizing a community planting project using American-provided seeds. I received my transfer orders, he informed her through an interpreter. I'm returning to America tomorrow. Sachiko nodded, understanding filling her eyes. War brought you here. Peace takes you home. She gestured to the village around them, where American and Japanese worked side by side. But connection remains. I don't know if I'll ever return to Japan, Willard admitted, but I'll never forget what happened here. Nor will we, Sachiko assured him. My son asks if all Americans are like Willard-san. I tell him many are once peace allows true hearts to speak. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a carefully folded paper crane. In our tradition, folding 1,000 cranes grants a wish. This is first of 1,000 I will fold, wishing for lasting peace between our peoples. Willard accepted the delicate paper creation, moved by the gesture. What can I offer in return? Continue to tell this story, she replied simply. That enemies became friends through simple act of compassion. That hunger was stronger than hate. That humanity survived even in darkest time of war. That evening, the village held a modest farewell ceremony for the departing Americans. Children performed traditional songs, elders offered formal thanks, and Captain Nakamura, in perhaps his most surprising gesture, presented Willard with his own officer's sword. This has been in my family for 3 generations, the captain explained stiffly. Tradition says it carries the spirit of its owners. I ask that you take it not as trophy of war, but as symbol of respect between warriors who have found honor in peace. Willard was stunned by the significance of the gesture. I cannot accept something so personal and valuable. Nakamura shook his head firmly. You must. In defeating Japan with both strength and mercy, America has earned respect. But in feeding those you could have bombed, you personally have earned honor. The sword represents that distinction. The following morning, as Willard's aircraft prepared to depart, the entire village gathered at the makeshift airfield. Sachiko stood at the front with Takeshi, who clutched a small American flag, fashioned from scraps of parachute silk and colored paper. As the engines started, Sachiko stepped forward and pressed something into Willard's hand, a simple origami boat made from the rice paper wrapper of an American ration bar. To carry you safely home, she explained, and to remember that even smallest acts of kindness can cross widest oceans. When the aircraft lifted off, Willard looked down to see the villagers waving, not in farewell to an enemy, but in gratitude to a friend. What had begun with a desperate woman's plea for help had transformed into something that transcended the bitter divisions of war. In the years that followed, the story of Matsushima would become part of the foundation narrative of post-war Japanese-American relations. Sachiko Tanaka would eventually travel to the United States in 1952 as part of a civilian exchange program, reuniting with Willard at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., celebrating 7 years of peaceful cooperation between former enemies. Captain Nakamura, after initial resistance to occupation policies, became an unexpected advocate for reconciliation within conservative Japanese military circles. His influence helped ease tensions during the difficult early years of Reconstruction, and he later credited the Matsushima model as changing his understanding of victory and defeat. Lieutenant Commander James Willard remained in the Navy after the war, eventually teaching at the Naval Academy, where he incorporated the lessons of Matsushima into his curriculum. "Military power determines who wins the war," he would tell his students, "but humanitarian actions determine who wins the peace." As for the village itself, Matsushima became a symbol of reconciliation, hosting one of the first friendship exchanges between Japanese and American schoolchildren in 1954. A small museum eventually commemorated the food drops that had sparked an improbable connection across enemy lines, featuring photographs, letters, and artifacts, including the original origami crane Sachiko had given Willard and the sword presented by Captain Nakamura. The unexpected compassion shown by American airmen to starving Japanese villagers had created a template for humanity in the midst of inhumanity, proving that even in war's darkest moments, individual acts of kindness could illuminate paths toward peace that diplomatic treaties alone could never establish. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.